Welcome to True Crime Threads. Today, a police officer's dark secret unfolds. In a quiet suburban town, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, life seemed to move at a slower pace. The streets were lined with well-kept homes, children played in the yards, and neighbors knew each other's names. It was the kind of place where people could relax, confident that they were safe and secure. But beneath the surface, there was a darker reality waiting to emerge, one that would shatter the town's idyllic facade. Officer Ethan Brooks had been a fixture in the community for years. He was known for his calm demeanor and his dedication to keeping the peace. He patrolled the streets with a quiet authority, admired by many for his fairness and his willingness to help those in need. Brooks had a reputation as a hard-working, reliable officer, a man who could be counted on in any situation. He was a protector, a guardian of the town's fragile sense of security, and for the most part, the town trusted him completely. But things began to change one summer evening when the body of Ivey Mitchell was discovered in her car, parked in a secluded alleyway on the outskirts of town. Ivey, a bright young woman in her mid-20s, was a familiar face in the community. She worked at the local diner, always greeting customers with a smile and a kind word. She had no known enemies, and everyone who knew her spoke highly of her. She was the kind of person who seemed too full of life to ever be a victim of violence. When the police were called to the scene, they initially believed it to be a case of a robbery gone wrong. Ivey's car appeared to have been broken into, though nothing of value was missing. She was slumped over the steering wheel, a single gunshot wound to the chest. The scene seemed eerily quiet, as if the life had been drained from the town along with Ivey's. Detectives arrived, quickly securing the scene and beginning their investigation. It didn't take long before the first signs of trouble emerged. The forensics team identified the type of bullet used in the murder, a type of ammunition typically used by law enforcement officers. At first, it was dismissed as a coincidence. After all, it wasn't uncommon for police officers to use standard-issue weapons, and many police officers in the area carried the same model. But when the ballistics report came in, the reality began to settle in. The bullet that killed Ivey had come from a service weapon issued to Officer Ethan Brooks. The discovery sent ripples through the police department. It was impossible to ignore the implications. At first, Brooks denied any involvement, claiming he had been at home that night. But investigators soon uncovered a troubling detail. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed a police car matching Brooks' vehicle parked just a few blocks from where Ivey's body had been discovered. The evidence against Brooks was mounting, but there were still questions. Could it be a mistake? Could there be some other explanation? In a town like this, people were reluctant to believe that someone they trusted, someone they respected, could be capable of such a brutal act. But the facts were undeniable, and the shadow of suspicion began to fall over Officer Brooks. As the investigation into Ivey's death continued, whispers spread through the town. People who had once viewed Brooks as a protector now began to wonder, had the person they trusted most betrayed them in the worst possible way? The tragedy of Ivey's death was only the beginning of a much darker story that was about to unfold. The investigation into Ivey Mitchell's death took a sharp turn the moment the ballistics report confirmed that the bullet that killed her came from Officer Ethan Brooks' weapon. It was a discovery that no one in the town of Crestwood had been prepared for. Ethan Brooks, the very officer who had been entrusted with protecting the community, now found himself the center of a homicide investigation. What began as an ordinary case of a robbery gone wrong suddenly evolved into something far more sinister. Detectives initially tried to piece together how Ivey had crossed paths with Brooks, but there were no obvious signs of a personal connection. Ivey was a regular diner waitress, someone who greeted everyone with a smile and was known for her kindness. There was no history between her and the officer that stood out, no known grievances or altercations. Yet the evidence, blood, a single gunshot wound, and the distinctive type of ammunition was undeniable. The immediate question was whether this was an isolated incident, a random act that somehow involved Brooks, or whether something darker was at play. As investigators dug deeper, the details grew murkier. The more they uncovered, the more it seemed that the peaceful small town they had thought they knew was hiding a troubling secret. In the days that followed, Brooks was questioned about his whereabouts the night of Ivey's death. He maintained his innocence, repeating his claim that he had been at home with his wife. His alibi, however, was flimsy at best. His wife, Angela, confirmed that he had been home, but there were inconsistencies in her account of the evening. When questioned further, she grew increasingly defensive, refusing to provide any more details. This raised further suspicion, particularly when it was revealed that no one else had been able to confirm Brooks' whereabouts. The investigation began to turn toward surveillance footage, which, after days of searching, finally yielded something crucial. Footage from a nearby gas station captured a police car parked several blocks from the scene of the murder on the night of Ivey's death. The car's markings were unmistakable. It was Brooks' vehicle. The footage had been captured at a time that directly contradicted his statements. It was now clear that Brooks had been in the area, which called into question his initial denial. Brooks was called in for a second round of questioning. His calm and confident demeanor from before began to crack. He repeatedly insisted that he had been at home, but the mounting evidence suggested otherwise. The police force, which had once stood behind him, now found themselves divided. Some were still unwilling to believe that one of their own could be capable of such a heinous crime, while others grew increasingly uncomfortable with the growing evidence against him. There was also a growing unease within the community. The townspeople, who had once viewed Officer Brooks as a reliable protector, began to question their own safety. How could someone they had trusted for years be implicated in such a brutal crime? Murmurs started to circulate. People spoke in hushed voices about strange behavior they had noticed from Brooks in the weeks leading up to Ivey's murder, an intensity in his gaze, a change in his demeanor, moments when he appeared almost obsessed with certain women in town. As the pressure mounted, new evidence began to emerge. A forensic analysis of Brooks' personal phone records revealed a pattern of frequent, unexplained calls to Ivey in the days leading up to her death. Despite the fact that they had no known personal relationship, these calls were undeniably connected. The more investigators looked into these communications, the clearer it became that Brooks had been watching Ivey, tracking her movements, learning her habits, waiting for the right moment to strike. The town was slowly being engulfed in a web of suspicion and fear. Was there more to this case than a tragic murder? Had Officer Brooks been involved in other similar incidents, or was Ivey an isolated target? The detectives could not ignore the unsettling possibility that the officer who had sworn to protect them might actually be the killer lurking among them. The investigation into Ivey's death was no longer just about finding the truth. It had become a fight to uncover the dark secrets that had been hidden in plain sight for so long. Weeks passed after the chilling discovery that Officer Ethan Brooks' weapon had been used to kill Ivey Mitchell. The investigation, which had initially been centered around a single death, now spiraled into something much more disturbing. The townspeople, still reeling from Ivey's murder, tried to move on with their lives, but the shadow of suspicion cast over Brooks loomed large. No one could escape the nagging questions: was he involved in Ivey's death? Was there more to this story? And could anyone be next? Then, in the early hours of a cold autumn morning, the town was rocked by another tragedy. Aleyna Daniels, a beloved teacher at the local high school, was found dead in her car, just like Ivey. The circumstances surrounding her death mirrored the first in an eerie, almost unnatural way. Her body was discovered in a quiet, dimly lit neighborhood on the outskirts of Crestwood, parked in her car with a single gunshot wound to her chest. The scene was calm, almost serene, yet the brutality of it was undeniable. She had been executed with chilling precision. At first it seemed like a random act of violence, a carjacking gone wrong, or perhaps a robbery that turned fatal. But as the investigation into Aleyna's death unfolded, the similarities to Ivey's case became impossible to ignore. The bullet that killed Aleyna had also come from a service weapon, this time a gun registered to Officer Brooks. It was a sickening confirmation that what had been thought of as an isolated event was now part of a disturbing pattern. Detectives working the case were immediately struck by how similar the two murders were. Both women had been well known in the community, living quiet, peaceful lives with no known enemies. Both had been shot in a secluded spot, far enough from the main roads to avoid immediate attention, but close enough to town that they wouldn't be missed for long. And both deaths had been carried out with a weapon that was only supposed to be in the hands of the police. The similarities were too much to ignore, and as the investigation progressed, the evidence began to point to a horrifying possibility Officer Brooks was the killer. Brooks' alibi from the night of Aleyna's death began to crumble under scrutiny. He had initially insisted he was at home, the same excuse he'd used in Ivey's case. But once again, there were inconsistencies. Surveillance footage showed Brooks' police car near the scene of the murder on the night Aleyna died. There was no mistaking it, the car matched the make and model of his vehicle. The footage showed the police car parked in the area just hours before Aleyna's body was found, but no one had seen Brooks leave the scene. His presence in the area made it impossible for him to maintain his story. With each new discovery, the case against Brooks became clearer. The pressure on the police department intensified. How could they have missed the signs? How could they have allowed someone with such a dark side to remain on the force for so long? The town of Crestwood, once safe and serene, was now living in fear. Residents locked their doors at night, afraid that the man they had trusted to protect them could be the one to endanger them. Aleyna's death added a new layer to the growing mystery. Detectives found that, like Ivey, Aleyna had been in contact with Brooks in the days leading up to her murder. There were strange phone calls, cryptic messages, and even rumors that Brooks had been seen following Aleyna on more than one occasion. It seemed that Aleyna had unwittingly become one of his targets, just like Ivey. The officers working the case began to suspect that Brooks had been systematically targeting women in the town, using his position to gain their trust, and then manipulating them to meet his twisted needs. As the investigation continued, the town was left in a state of constant unease. What had started as a simple murder investigation had now evolved into a full-blown manhunt. It wasn't just about finding a killer anymore, it was about uncovering a dark underworld that had existed just below the surface of their community. And as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, it became increasingly clear that Officer Brooks had been hiding in plain sight for far too long. The horrifying truth was that the person who had been sworn to protect them had been the one bringing death to their doorstep all along. As the investigation into the murders of Ivey Mitchell and Aleyna Daniels deepened, the evidence pointing toward Officer Ethan Brooks grew undeniable. His alibi had unraveled completely, and the surveillance footage showing his police car near both crime scenes left little room for doubt. But there was still one question hanging in the air: why? What was the motive behind these senseless killings? Was it personal, or was there something more disturbing lurking beneath the surface? Detectives began to dig into Brooks' past, hoping to uncover any clues that might explain his violent actions. They learned that he had been with the police force for over a decade, earning respect and admiration for his dedication to his work. He had a spotless record, no complaints, no disciplinary actions, and certainly no signs of the dark impulses that now seemed to define him. But the deeper they dug, the more unsettling details began to emerge. Brooks had always been a quiet man, reserved and private, but there were rumors of troubling behavior that had never been addressed. Some colleagues recalled moments when Brooks seemed oddly fixated on certain women in the town. He had a way of watching them from a distance, always careful not to cross any boundaries, but his gaze would linger in a way that made people uncomfortable. It was subtle, nothing that could ever be reported or proven, but enough to make those who noticed it uneasy. One former colleague recalled a strange incident that had occurred a few years earlier. Brooks had become obsessed with a woman who had recently moved to town. She had turned down his advances, and after that she began to receive anonymous messages, cryptic, unsettling notes that seemed to be watching her every move. At the time, no one connected the dots, but looking back, it was clear that Brooks had been involved in more than just a simple crush. His obsession with women had always been there, buried beneath his professional exterior. The more the detectives uncovered, the clearer it became that Ivey and Aleyna were not random victims. They had both been targeted by Brooks, carefully chosen for reasons that had yet to be fully understood. Forensic analysis of their phone records revealed that Brooks had been in contact with both women in the days leading up to their deaths. In fact, he had made repeated calls to Ivey in the weeks before she was killed, asking about her whereabouts, about her life. The messages were innocent at first, casual inquiries about work and small talk, but as time went on, they grew more personal. It was clear that he had been watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. Aleyna, too, had been receiving strange messages from Brooks, although they were more direct and unsettling. The nature of his communication with her hinted at something darker and unhealthy obsession that had been growing over time. As investigators pieced together the puzzle, they realized that Brooks had been systematically stalking his victims, learning their routines, and using his position to gain access to their lives. He had been the one pulling the strings, manipulating them from the shadows, all while maintaining his facade as a well-respected police officer. But it wasn't just the victims' interactions with Brooks that raised alarm. A whistleblower from within the police department came forward, revealing that Brooks had been involved in multiple previous incidents of harassment and inappropriate behavior, all of which had been swept under the rug by his colleagues. There had been reports of him following women home late at night, of him using his authority to intimidate and manipulate, but these incidents had been quietly ignored. The department had turned a blind eye to his actions, either out of loyalty to one of their own or out of fear that challenging him would bring unwanted attention to their own complicity. This revelation sent shockwaves through the department. It was clear now that Officer Brooks had not only been a predator hiding in plain sight, but that the corruption ran deep within the police force itself. The officers who had failed to act, who had allowed his behavior to continue unchecked, now had blood on their hands as well. The truth was far more complicated and sinister than anyone had imagined. As the investigation reached a boiling point, the town was left in turmoil. Once proud of their law enforcement, the residents of Crestwood were now questioning everything they thought they knew about the system that had promised to protect them. Officer Brooks had been a monster, but the real horror lay in the fact that his monstrous behavior had been allowed to thrive, protected by a system that had failed the community at every turn. The truth was finally out, but it came at a devastating cost: the lives of two innocent women and the collapse of trust in the very institution that was supposed to keep them safe. The arrest of Officer Ethan Brooks was a moment that seemed to freeze time in Crestwood. The small town, once filled with the comfort of routine, was now consumed by a sense of betrayal and horror. Brooks, the man who had sworn an oath to protect, was now a criminal in their eyes, the truth finally unveiled. But even as the investigation into his crimes reached its conclusion, new layers of darkness emerged that shook the town to its core. Brooks was charged with the murders of Ivey Mitchell and Aleyna Daniels, but the investigation didn't stop there. As authorities continued to scrutinize his life, they discovered that these two deaths were not isolated incidents. Brooks had been involved in several other disturbing episodes, each one more chilling than the last. While the police department had failed to connect the dots at the time, investigators found evidence of Brooks' escalating obsession with women in the community. His actions had been building up to something catastrophic, a plan that had been years in the making. It was revealed that Brooks had been stalking other women in Crestwood, keeping detailed notes about their routines, their families, and their personal lives. He had created a hidden journal, one that had gone unnoticed for years, filled with his thoughts and fantasies about his victims. In it, he wrote about how he saw himself as a protector, justifying his increasingly erratic behavior by convincing himself that he was saving the women from something, that they needed him. His twisted logic had justified every step of his descent into violence. The journal also contained disturbing drawings, sketches of the women he had stalked, some of whom had never even realized they were being watched. The revelation of Brooks' journal sent shockwaves through the police department. Many of his colleagues had known him for years, and to them he had always seemed like a solid, reliable officer. They were shaken to learn that this man, whom they had trusted to work alongside them every day, had been hiding such a disturbing side. Some felt guilty for not seeing the signs sooner, while others felt angry, betrayed by a system that had allowed such a monster to remain in their ranks for so long. The department's failure to act was now under investigation, with some officers facing internal disciplinary action for their part in covering up Brooks' behavior. The families of Ivey and Aleyna were left grappling with the enormity of their loss. For Ivey's parents, the pain was especially raw. Their daughter had been kind-hearted and full of life, a young woman with so much ahead of her. To know that she had been targeted by someone she had trusted was a cruelty beyond words. Aleyna's family, too, was left to pick up the pieces of their broken lives. She had been a teacher who cared deeply for her students, someone who had impacted the lives of so many, and to see her life cut short so violently was a tragedy they couldn't understand. Both families, now bound together by tragedy, found some solace in the knowledge that the person responsible for their loved ones' deaths would be held accountable. The trial of Officer Ethan Brooks began with all eyes on the small courthouse in Crestwood. The courtroom was filled with residents, reporters, and loved ones of the victims, all eager to witness the proceedings and finally find some closure. Brooks sat in the defendant's chair, his face cold and unreadable. His once pristine uniform now seemed like a cruel reminder of his betrayal. The prosecutor's case was strong, built on a mountain of evidence: his weapon, the surveillance footage, the phone records, and the damning journal. Yet, despite the overwhelming proof against him, Brooks' defense team tried to paint him as a man who had lost control, a victim of circumstances, a man who was broken by the stress of his job. The trial was grueling, but as it drew to a close, the jury deliberated only briefly. When the verdict came down guilty on all charges, the courtroom erupted in a mix of emotions. Some found relief in the conviction, while others could only mourn the fact that the man who had taken 2 precious lives had once been a protector in their town. Brooks was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a fitting end for a man whose actions had caused irreparable damage to so many lives. The town of Crestwood was left to rebuild, but the scars of what had happened would never fully heal. Trust in the police had been shattered, and though the community vowed to move forward, there would always be a shadow hanging over them. They had learned a painful lesson: sometimes the most dangerous people are those who hide in plain sight, and the systems we trust the most can be the very ones that fail us. The case of Officer Ethan Brooks, now a tragic chapter in the town's history, would be a constant reminder of the darkness that can lurk even in the most unsuspecting places.